Greetings and salutations, friends. My name is Tristan, the audio guy, and today we're looking at how I changed this legendary microphone into this legendary microphone. So this video is kind of long and in-depth, so if you'd like, I have the timestamps in the description below. You can jump around and check out whatever you'd like throughout the video. So be sure to stick around if you're into frequency analysis graphs, microphone shootouts, and DIY projects. So people might be asking, why would you want to do something crazy like this, make this microphone 90-degree angles? And that's mostly for space savings. So if you consider this microphone here, right above it is a photo of the microphone with an XLR cable, and you can see that it's about 9 inches in length. So as we try and place this microphone on snare drums, guitar cabinets, especially snare drums, on a crowded stage when you have to mic things live, you'll notice that you'll have tons of stuff in the way while you're trying to place the microphone. Things like drum hardware, cymbals, other mic stands, other microphones in the way. So having a microphone that is kind of like this is 4.5 inches long with the XLR cable at the bottom, coming from the bottom. So it has no, the XLR cable is not sticking out of the back there. So 4.5 inches long, this is quite a space saver when it comes to being in the proximity of the snare drum, where there's a lot of equipment situated on the stage or in the studio. Another reason this microphone is advantageous is within an ISO cab. So if you're building your own, you kind of want to budget it out and have some space savings. You don't want to build a massive ISO cab. You can mod yourself one of these, and you won't have to build your ISO cab as deep. Or if you have a pre-made ISO cab that's already not that deep, you can use this microphone instead of this one and save a bunch of space and be able to move it around in any direction that you please. So there are alternatives to doing a modification like this to the microphone. If you have the budget for it, you can go ahead and purchase yourself a Grinnelli Labs SM57 right-angled. They make them, you can just buy them off of Sweetwater. Another alternative would be the Wilkinson Labs SM57 clip. So all you do is unscrew it from here, and then you kind of just place the microphone at a right angle, and you have this 3D printed clip that goes around the body of the microphone, and it takes one screw in. So the reason why I don't like that option is because I watched the video, and it looks to be that the plastic 3D printed clip that goes around the body is kind of flimsy and looks very thin. So I don't think it would do a very good job sealing the microphone together. Even if you put tape or something, it could flex, over time. The temperature and humidity and stuff will change the plastic and the shape of it. Another thing too is that the air within the SM57 is actually kind of important, and it does have an effect on the sound of the microphone too. Most people would think that sound comes into the mic from around it, but according to Shure, there's actually a small air chamber within the microphone here that helps to create the legendary SM57 sound. So if you take a look here, you can actually see that transformer right in there. It's the little yellow tab down there. And there's actually some space where these wires are, where there's actually air. So once you screw the microphone together, there's a small sealed air chamber, which according to Shure helps create the legendary SM57 sound. Now, Shure doesn't make these from the factory stock. You can actually check out this website that I'll link in the description below. That mentions the fact that Shure doesn't make the 90-degree angle ones, and that's due to the chamber within. Doing this mod adds some more air to that chamber, so therefore it changes that unique tone. Now Grinnelli Labs was able to probably reduce the air within that chamber and make it the similar air volume that it is in the standard SM57, so they claim it doesn't have any effect on the tone. But if you watch the rest of the video, you can see that this mod makes barely any difference to the sound of this stock microphone, but you can watch the rest of the details about that later on in the video. There was a final method that I thought was really interesting. So this one is the very cheapest option, and that's taking a buttload of tape, preferably gaff tape, and you just kind of take the microphone like this, and you just wrap a bunch of tape around it, like around the body and the capsule, so that it's kind of almost locked in place by the tape so that it doesn't move anymore. Now, I thought that was an interesting idea, but I chose to not do that because it seems like it is pretty flimsy and wouldn't hold up, on stage or in the studio, getting thrown into gig bags and stuff day in and day out. You'd probably have to redo it multiple times. Or if you're recording in the studio and you grab the mic wrong or something, it'll actually change the direction of the capsule because you grabbed it wrong, and that wouldn't be good for recordings where you need to have the same sound over and over again. This method here is extremely rigid, barely moves at all. It seems like it has the stability that maybe the Gridley Labs would have because it is just plastic and metal. Yeah, it doesn't really budge a whole lot. You'll see later on in the video that I shake the microphone a lot. It barely moves at all. It's very, very rigid. I definitely prefer this over the more budget option where you just tape around it. So for this project, you are going to need to know how to solder. However, soldering is very fun, and you could use it. You could use that skill that you learn here for numerous other projects in the future if you're kind of a DIY guy like me. A lot of these, I chose to do this method as well because I had a lot of the tools and materials around in my garage where I made it. So I chose to do this method for that reason also. I'll go ahead and list all the things that you're going to need for this project down here. First of all, you're going to need some wire. You can get those from any local electronics store around. You could get 2 different colors if you'd like, or if you're on a real budget, you can just get 1 wire and just make sure to mark it maybe with a Sharpie which wire is which, because you don't want to flip the polarity by accident within the microphone. That would be bad. And any sort of thin wire would work. 24 gauge is what I used, copper. That seems to conduct very well. There's very low voltages coming from the capsule into the transformer, so you don't need anything too thick. Secondly, you're going to need to get the pipe. So I bought this. It originally was white, and I got it from Home Depot. I'm sure you could get some from Lowe's too. They're just 90-degree angle pipes. I believe it's 3/4 inches. You'll see later in the video. But I ended up spray painting it black so that it would be more of a uniform finish rather than having this really big piece of white in the middle. So it looks a little more professional on stage and in the studio. Next, you're going to need the microphone, of course. And then you're going to need some tape. So if you notice, I wrapped some tape around the creases here so that it would be a little bit more uniform. You don't have these, shiny things sticking out from the, you being able to see the threads and the silver within it. Any sort of tape works. I use gaff tape for this project because it's kind of, it doesn't leave behind any gross adhesive when you're done using it. So all I have to do is unwrap it and I can put it back to stock with no problem. If you use something like electrical tape or masking tape, you might have some adhesive left over if you ever need to remove it or replace the tape along the edges. And gaff tape is very widely used in the studio and on stage. Just make sure to get some thicker sort of tape if you don't end up using gaff tape, because the threads here on the mic need to grip the tape that you've wrapped around this pipe in the inside. Next, you're going to need a heat gun or a blow dryer. Either one works. I use the heat gun, put it on low, and that's just to make sure that the heat shrink that you use shrinks really well to the wires so that it doesn't expose the wires to any sort of ground or short. Next, I got 320 grit sandpaper, which I used to sand across the pipe so that the spray paint I used would adhere better. You could probably use something grittier if you'd like, maybe 200 grit or 100, but just know you're going to see a lot of the sandpaper marks that you made. I used 320 grit, and you can see pretty clearly the scratch marks and stuff that you leave behind. If you go finer, you could probably use 400 or 500 grit and barely see them, a lot less. Your choice. Next, as I mentioned earlier, you need the heat shrink so that you can solder so that you can make sure that you protect the joints that you make from the existing wires to the new wires that you install. And you're obviously going to need a soldering iron and some solder because you do need to add some solder to these tabs once you're done, and then also to connect the wires you're going to need some extra solder for that as well. I also like to use flux. It helps the solder bond to the wires a little bit better when you use flux. You also saw me use pliers within the video, and so that's just to help if you have any sort of weird conundrums that are going on. It'll help you it'll help you figure stuff out a little easier than just using your fingers. And finally, I used some black spray paint. I used high temperature spray paint, but I'm sure you could use some regular spray paint, but I figured it'd be best so that when you do use the heat gun on it to make sure that that the pipe expands a little bit to accept the threads of the capsule, that it doesn't melt the spray paint or make it all flaky or damage it in any way. The high temperature stuff works the best because you're going to be using a heat gun on the pipe. All right, and up next is how to build it. So here we have the 90-degree angle pipe I got from Home Depot for about $3. It's got a little flange end extruded and then a intruded flange on the other end. And I go ahead and prep it by removing any of the sticky adhesive from the labels. And then I go ahead and sand it down later to make sure that there's no extra adhesive when I do the spray painting process. Here I'm using 320 grit sandpaper. to make sure I kind of turn the pipe into more of a matte finish rather than a glossy finish, so that the spray paint adheres better to the pipe. All in all, it took me about 10 minutes to do all the sanding here. Next, I go ahead and wipe off the pipe with a nice clean towel so that the paint adheres without any problems. And then I go ahead and double check to make sure it's pretty even. I sanded evenly around the entire pipe. So next I went ahead and purchased some black high heat spray paint so that the pipe would blend in better with the SM57. And I spray paint all angles and edges and sides so that I make sure I have a nice even coating along the entire pipe. Then I go ahead and wait an hour, and then I come back and I do a second coating, doing the same processes. Upon unscrewing the microphone, you'll find two wires, a positive and a negative, green being positive, negative being yellow. I then start to desolder the wires from the microphone capsule, starting with the yellow one, which comes out pretty easy, but then the green one does not come out that easy, and I end up having to cut it with some scissors and then restrip it in preparation for resoldering it back. After cutting the wire off the tab, I then desolder some of the extra wire and pull it off with some pliers. Next, we're going to cut some heat shrink and then cut some wire and prep it to solder onto the existing wires inside the microphone by fishing it through the pipe. If you notice me twisting some of the ends of the wires, that's just me getting ready to prep the wires getting soldered together so that nothing penetrates the heat shrink and it's a nice clean joint. Once the wires are nice and prepped, I then dip some flux into each wire so that the solder grabs the wire easier and then can then melt onto the next wire so that they join nice and smoothly together. And I do that for both wires. So now I'm soldering the new wires onto the existing ones within the SM57. There they are, nice and clean looking. And then time to put the heat shrink on. Once they're over nice and once they're slid over nicely, we then go to the heat gun. Here I have it on a very low setting, so I don't need any gloves, and I'm not melting the wires, but I'm just making sure that the heat shrink grabs to the wire nicely. Please use gloves when using a heat gun. I did not because the temperature was set really low. Once the new wires are joined onto the old wires, you can then slide the wires through the 90-degree angle pipe, and then you can begin soldering the new wires onto the tabs on the microphone capsule. After I solder the wires into the tabs, I then use some pliers to kind of squeeze the wire onto the tabs and make sure they're nice and tight on there. And then I dab some more solder onto the top to ensure that connection is nice and strong. I then heat up the pipe in preparation for the microphone capsule to slide into it. I forgot to record this part, but once the pipe is heated up, then you go ahead and take the microphone capsule and you thread it into the heated pipe. I shot things a little out of order too, so sorry about that. So here I'm laying a layer of gaff tape across the extruded part of the 90-degree angle pipe so that the transformer end of the microphone, the threads can grab the pipe a little bit better when you try and thread it on. You can use other types of tape too that's pretty thick. I just used this because it worked best in my situation. I then screw in the transformer end of the microphone into the pipe with some force to make sure it's nice and secure, and this is what the final product ends up looking like. I ended up having some gaff tape squeeze out in the corner there and it was kind of bugging me, so I went and took some pliers and cut it out so it's got a nice even cleaner look to it. I ended up not liking how you could see the edges of the pipe, so I ended up wrapping it in even more gaff tape just so that it kind of looks a little more seamless, especially when you view it from kind of a distance, if it's ever on stage or visible to the public. I then did the shake test to make sure nothing falls off and it's pretty solid. Now that we've finished modifying the SM57, we're going to go ahead and shoot it out. The modded SM57 has this cool advantage where it can be placed right next to the hi-hat stand versus the conventional SM57, which is right next to it. And as you can see, I tried to align the capsules as best as possible, put them as close together without touching. Please note, I am a guitar player, not a drummer. Here's what they sound like back to back. often play with the big fat snare drum ring, so I decided to include it in the shootout so I could hear what it sounds like with these microphones. Okay, so here we are in Logic. We're going to analyze the frequency of each microphone, and we're going to check out the output too, because there are slight differences in here. So let's bring up the durometers real quick. These are going to give us a good look at the output of each microphone. They are set to hold, so whatever transient happens, it'll measure the output of the microphone. So we have the original SM57 here on the left at negative 14 dBFS, and we have the modified SM57 here at negative 15 dBFS. So there is a very slight drop in output from the microphone for the modified one. Okay, so I have both channels bused to this Foxango Span frequency analyzation plugin. And they're both going to appear here once I press play, and we're going to see what the differences are between the two microphones with the same snare drum hit through both microphones. So here we have both microphones coming in on different colors. So we have the stock SM57 as the orange, pink, red graph, and then we have the blue line here, and that one's going to be the modified SM57. So as you can tell, there's a little bit more output when it comes to the stock one, and things tend to be a little smoother, it seems, with the stock one also. The modified one seems to have more peaks and valleys when it comes to in terms of frequency response here. So let's go ahead and set it to no smoothing, and we can kind of see what's going on a little bit better in the low end here as we zoom in. So we have some different peaks and valleys here. Yeah, things tend to be a little smoother looking with the stock SM57, and things tend to be a little bit less smooth with the modified one. If you take a look at the overall graph, you can see here, I need to smooth this part out to see what that looks like better. But the low end seems to be quite different between both microphones. And so here we have smoothed at 1/12 of an octave. We can go ahead and zoom in on the high end now. We can see that there's been some trade-offs here happening at the very top end of the microphones. So we have the modified SM57 coming in with the inverse of what looks like the stock SM57 here. We have some extra information here at 10K from the stock SM57. We got quite a little dip here with the stock one as well, around 8K. And then we have another peak here at 7K. And then we have the inverse with modified SM57. So we have a dip at 7K. We have a big old peak at 8K, not a peak I guess, but a little roll off here at 8K, and then it continues down until you get to about 10.5K. And then it seems to be pretty close when it comes to the mid-range, but it seems like the low end and the very high end are the most affected here when it comes to this microphone, these two different microphones. Another thing to note is that these microphones were placed very close together, and I tried to align the capsules as close as possible. But sometimes even doing that will cause the microphones to be slightly different when it comes to frequency response, just because one might be closer ever so slightly to the rim, and same with the other one. So that could be one of the reasons why it's not closer than this. All right, thanks so much for watching. Let me know in the comment section if you decided to do this project and how successful it went. Thanks for watching.